the prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means, and my people love to have it so. And what will ye do in the end thereof? In the last video, and I have a link to the right of the video if you need to see it again, we saw John Piper admit he believes in Universal Atonement. Universal Atonement is the Arminian and Roman Catholic belief that God loves all people, both elect and reprobate, intends to save all people, both elect and reprobate, and that Jesus Christ died for all people, elect and reprobate. Universal Atonement is the Arminian and Roman Catholic belief that Christ's death only made salvation possible. Arminians and Catholics will claim the death of Christ is necessary but not sufficient, while they assert that salvation is an additional work of man's free will. Thus, to affirm Universal Atonement is to reject justification by faith alone. Let's listen to John Piper's profession of Universal Atonement one more time.
And I'm going to quote Millard Erickson's Theology, because I think he's right. He says, God intended the atonement to make salvation possible for all persons. Christ died for all persons, but this atoning death becomes effective only when accepted by the individual. This is the view of all Arminians. Close quote.
Now in this video we will take a closer look at the theology of Millard J. Erickson. After all, John Piper tells us that he believes Millard J. Erickson's theology is correct concerning the doctrine of limited atonement. Millard J. Erickson, like John Piper, is a Baptist theologian, and if you are familiar with Erickson's theology, then you understand why John Piper would recommend him concerning the doctrine of the atonement. Why, you ask? Because Millard J. Erickson rejects limited atonement in favor of universal atonement. However, unlike John Piper, Erickson is honest enough to state that he rejects limited atonement. Piper deceptively leads his audience into believing that Erickson teaches limited atonement. Thus, not only has Piper failed to teach limited atonement correctly, but he has also failed to correctly identify Erickson's position concerning the atonement. Two mistakes in one quote. The Millard J. Erickson quote Piper used came from Erickson's systematic theology titled Christian Theology. That exact quote was taken from Erickson's section titled Universal Atonement. It was not taken from Erickson's section titled Particular Atonement, which is another name for limited atonement. The quote Piper gave us was part of a paragraph Millard J. Erickson wrote teaching Universal Atonement. I have a link to the right of the video you can click on, which will present you with an actual photograph of the very page Piper quoted from. You will notice the quote clearly is located under the section titled Universal Atonement. In the previous section, Erickson correctly identified the position of limited atonement. He made it clear that limited atonement teaches that Christ's death did not make salvation possible for all persons, but to render salvation certain only to the elect. See Christian Theology, page 826. Only after Erickson discusses limited atonement does he then take up the topic of universal atonement, on page 829. Why did John Piper fail to inform us that the quote he used from Erickson's theology, the quote he stated is correct, came from a section where Erickson was teaching universal, not limited atonement? The answer is that John Piper is lying. He's a liar. That is what heretics do. They lie about the truth. Piper wants to give the doctrine of universal atonement a new name. He wants to rename it limited atonement, and he hopes no one will catch him. Well, Millard J. Erickson, the man Piper endorsed, the man Piper claimed was correct, goes on to tell us his personal beliefs concerning the doctrine of the atonement. Erickson writes, I quote, We must consider statements like 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 1, which affirms that some for whom Christ died do perish. End quote. Christian Theology, page 834. So Millard J. Erickson, the man Piper thinks is correct, teaches that some of the people Christ died for will die and go to hell. This is blasphemy. This implies that Christ is a failure, unable to accomplish his desires despite being omnipotent God. This is the teaching of the man John Piper endorses. The conclusion that Millard J. Erickson comes to concerning the doctrine of the atonement follows. Erickson writes, quote, "We conclude that the hypothesis of universal atonement is able to account for a larger segment of the biblical witness with less distortion than is the hypothesis of limited atonement." End quote. Christian Theology, page 835. All right. We see again that John Piper is not a Calvinist, nor is his buddy Millard J. Erickson. I will leave you with a wonderful passage from an actual Calvinist. Listen carefully. Quote, "Most churches in the United States that call themselves Christian reject the gospel. They teach, if they are liberal, that Jesus was a good man, even a martyr, but he died in no one's place. Or, if they are conservative, that Jesus died in everyone's place, desires all men to be saved, and offers salvation to all. But it really makes little difference whether a church is large, respectable, liberal, and teaches that Jesus died for no one, or enthusiastic, growing, conservative, and teaches that Jesus died for everyone. The result is the same. Jesus Christ actually saves no one at all. Both liberals and conservatives agree that people save themselves by an exercise of their wills. The conservative Christ makes salvation possible if people will only let him into their hearts. The liberal Christ points the way to salvation if people will but follow his example. Neither Christ saves." Quoted from Dr. John W. Robbins' foreword, taken from the book The Atonement, Gordon H. Clark.